Good day, I'm Dr. T and welcome to my office. So let's talk about deadlines. Whenever we give an assignment that's going to be graded, of course the students need to do it, give it back to us so we can then grade it and give them their grade. Well, in that process, they need to give it back to us. They need to know when to do so, so of course we set the deadline. And that will have a multitude of factors of actually when you set that deadline for which assignment, etc. And I'm not going into that. What I do want to talk briefly about, though, is how flexible those deadlines are going to be. Because when you're setting up those deadlines, you also need to establish how firm is that deadline. Is that a set in stone, if you're a second off, I'm not taking the assignment at all? Or is that a, if you could get it in this day, that would be great. Sometime the next week, that's fine. I don't really care. And there's actually a lot more than you might think goes in that decision. For starters, when are you going to grade these? You almost always want to grade assignments together as a batch. There'll be individual differences, things you didn't anticipate in the grading, partial credit, and that kind of stuff that you want to be consistent. And the easiest way to be consistent, or the best way to be consistent, is to know how you graded all of the other ones and just keep doing that. And maybe even going back and changing how you graded assignments because you decided to change exactly how you're grading, how you're awarding partial credit and other more subjective things. Obviously, if it's a very objective, say multiple choice or pure math-based with no partial credit, then this really isn't a consideration. Rubrics will help a lot here, especially if a good detailed rubric, but you'll find that you lack the imagination to find all the wrong ways the students can answer certain questions. By the way, I should also point out that when you're grading things like tests that have bunches of different questions, you're almost always better off grading one question on every test and then the next question on every test than trying to grade the whole test for one student and then the whole test for the next student and so on and so forth. This way you can be consistent. You don't have to keep the whole test in your brain. You just have to keep whatever question you're currently grading in your brain to maintain consistency. Now, this factors back into your grade deadline. Are you going to be grading these very shortly after they come back? In that case, that deadline needs to be pretty tight. Otherwise, if the student hasn't turned it in for a week, then you either grade theirs separately and risk having an inconsistent grading, or you have to wait and not grade everyone's, and everyone has to wait for that student to get their assignment in for you to grade them. Not to mention, that messes with your schedule. However, if you know you're not going to actually be grading these for a week for whatever reason, like you are also giving a test that's going to take precedence or something like that, well, in that case, then, hey, you feel free to be flexible because the real deadline when you're actually going to grade them is a little bit later on. And there's definitely been some cases where I've said, okay, here's the deadline. Now, I'm not going to grade them until this day, so I don't care if this is the deadline, but yeah, you can get it in 2 days late. That's fine. I don't care. But other ones, like, I know I need to grade them that next day. That's the way the scheduling works. Especially if you got like add drop coming in or withdraw deadlines, that kind of thing, where you have to get grades in. Okay, so that's one consideration. Next consideration is actually a pair of considerations, and this is all about the students. And so you're not going to have uniform students. Not every student the same. These are all people. They're all different. You're going to have a blend of students, but unfortunately you have to set basically one policy. You can have contingency plans in that policy, but if you say, I want this to be a rigid deadline, then it needs to be a rigid deadline for everyone. Obviously, if they come in and say, like, oh, here's a doctor note, I was quarantined, that's one thing. That's a contingency, and you want to have those built into your syllabus. But a general, oh, I didn't get it done, that's not a contingency. That's a, well, what is that particular assignment's policy for deadlines? Was it a tight deadline, in which case, sorry. Or was it a flexible deadline? Well, get it to me quick. Now, there are two types of students with issues in this particular case. So the first type that I usually like to think about are those students who have a lot of other things going on in their life. They may be parents taking care of children, or they may be taking care of their own parents or family members, etc. They may work a job. They've got a lot going on that they need to juggle, or they may have health concerns. You could add dozens of lists, and we can just about all add coronavirus to this list. And for these individuals, they need the flexibility to be able to address their children's needs today and work on the assignment later, because certain things will inherently have to come before your assignments. Family does matter. If one is a parent, their kids have to come first. That's kind of part of the gig. So for these students, they really need the flexibility. They need to loose deadlines. However, they're not the only students you're going to have, and there's another group that will actually be harmed by the more flexible deadlines. And these students are somewhat less mature. Typically, they're going to be somewhat younger, where the older students will typically fall into the previous category. Not always. Once again, this is a tendency, not a prediction. But you will find some of your students really need structure. They need to have deadlines. In fact, one of the things that they may need to learn the most from your course is that they have to pay attention to deadlines. There are some students who aren't going to learn that you have to hit the deadline until they get burned by it and get a couple of low grades. And that may actually be more valuable than anything else you're trying to teach them. So for these students, they need strict deadlines. They need to know that this is due on this day. They cannot do it afterwards. They can't put it off. And I've had students where I've had flexible deadlines, they would get close to it. They might do a little bit, but they wouldn't get the assignment done. And then it would start encroaching on the next assignment's deadline. And it would start snowballing to the point where they were not able to do the work on the course. Because at the end of the course, once the course is over, that deadline is that deadline. Your grades are due. You have deadlines too. And that ended up very poorly for them. And they might be able to get an incomplete, but policies on those are kind of intermittent. And once again, this is probably not beneficial to them. In general, incompletes for most students aren't good things. So for these students, you want fairly strict deadlines. You want to pace out and do the planning for them because they don't have the maturity to do that, at least not at this time. Now, it depends entirely on your blend of students. You need to know what kind of students you normally expect in your course and adapt accordingly. Because unfortunately, you have to pick a policy. And this then means that how you set those deadlines, you get to blend it for your students. Yeah, things are going kind of rough right now, but you don't want to make them too open-ended for most of your deadlines because that will actually make it worse for some of your students. Your blend of students will, of course, determine how open-ended versus how rigid those deadlines need to be. And nothing says it has to be the same for every assignment. So with that said, I hope I've given you a few things to think about, and have a wonderful day.